Henry Pelling is one of the leading British historians of the Labour movement, has worked both on the history of the Labour Party and on the history of trade unions, but has gone beyond that, working on British general elections, the social geography of elections, and also American history. And I wondered if we could begin at the beginning. You began by reading classics at Cambridge, did part one. Why then did you switch to history for part two?
Well, it was really because of the intervention of the war. I somehow thought that if I was going to do any research of any sort, that it would be more interesting to work on the contemporary period rather than the past. This was, I suppose, the effect of the war itself, and that the whole German archives, for instance, were free to be. Although, as it turned out, I worked on British history and not on, as I had thought originally I would work on, not on European history.
Was the
sometimes I regret the fact that I didn't perhaps go in for Venetian history, which would have enabled me to go and sit in Venice and work on the economic archives there, which would be very pleasant.
Was the social experience of the war in any particular way important in pushing you in this direction, or not?
Not especially, I don't think, no. Originally I read classics only because of my parents' wish. They wanted me to become a lawyer. And I gradually discovered when I was at Cambridge that, having belonged to the Union Society, I was not a very good off-the-cuff speaker. And so I didn't see a future for myself in the law. But my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, had given his first brief to Lord Birkenhead as a solicitor on the Liverpool circuit. And that was why I was supposed to follow in the path of Birkenhead.
I see.
In fact, you see, I was born in Birkenhead and brought up there at the same school as he was.
But the decision to work on the early history of the ILP was not in any way influenced, at least you don't think it was, by a sort of wartime democracy or a feeling of an interest in a kind of progressive politics.
I was interested in politics. I was interested in the Labour Party victory in '45. I had been in the army in Germany at the time of the election. I'd been actually election returning officer there for my unit. So I suppose that did help, yes. And what happened was that Professor Poston of this university, who was a medievalist really, was lecturing on 19th century economic history of Britain. And I went to his lectures, and eventually I asked, when I did fairly well in the end, I discovered I had a research studentship for at least 2 years. I said to him, what should I do research on? I'm interested in left-wing things. And he said, well, why not do a history of the Communist Party? So I said, I think that'd be too difficult and too controversial at the moment. Besides, you couldn't get the evidence.
Yes.
That was before the Khrushchev revelations of '56, of course, when, of course, it did become possible to do. And I did later on do a history of the Communist Party. But at that time, I thought it was impossible. So he said, well, why not do the ILP, which hasn't been done? So I decided to do the ILP. So my original proposition for research was a history of the ILP from 1893, when it was founded, to 1932, when it disaffiliated from the Labour Party. That was my original project.
And that just got out of hand, did it? I mean,
it became too much. When I went on with the research, I discovered it was too big a subject. So I gradually cut it down, first of all to 1918 as terminal point, then to 1914, in consultation with my supervisor, who was Dennis Broken, then to 1906, and finally the thesis I submitted was on the origins and early history of the ILP, 1880 to 1900.
And what was your attitude to the Attlee government at the time? I mean, you were favourably disposed to the government, were you?
Yes, and of course I saw something of, I saw a microcosm of the Labour Party in the University Labour Club. I saw that there were very many different motives among the members of the club for belonging. It interested me that these different motives, which I thought needed further exploration. That was one thing. People go in for politics for different reasons. Yes. I want to work out what they were, how they came together.
Right. And did you have any, I mean, given the experience of many of your generation, did you have any encounter with Marxism? I mean, were you influenced by it, or did you reject it on thinking about it, or did you just pass it by?
I think I was influenced by Marxism, certainly as a tool for economic history especially. I remember when I was first an undergraduate, the Cambridge University Socialist Club, which included the communists, produced the Christopher Hill's book, English Revolution, 1640 to 1940. That book was being sold by a very able young graduate of Oxford, research fellow of Oxford.
Yes.
And I read that with interest. But I was put off belonging to the Socialist Club because it was communists to run. And I didn't agree with the communists, especially in this period of the Cold War,
yes.
1939 to 41. I mean, the period of I shouldn't say the Cold War, I should say the phony war, perhaps. Well, of course, the communists were against the war right till 41, when Russia was invaded. I didn't like the way they simply followed the communist line,
yes,
the Russian line.
In the introduction to your thesis, which eventually became, in a modified form, the origins of the Labour Party, you thank particularly Dennis Brogan as your supervisor and Asa Briggs, and I wondered how these two influenced, if they did, the final outcome.
Well, Dennis was my supervisor, but he was not, in fact, of very great help to me, but I felt I had to put in a courtesy thank you to him.
So, I mean, he just...
But I think that was more or less more courtesy than anything else. When I went to see him, he was always wrapping up or undoing parcels and things.
I see.
He was not paying very much attention to me. But the only thing he could do, he was interested in French and American history,
yes,
and not really in British history at all.
Yes.
The only thing he did do was he gave me a good many introductions in Scotland. For instance, to Patrick Dolan, who was then, who had been prominent in the ILP in early years,
yes,
and was then, I think, had just retired from being Lord Provost of Glasgow.
Yes. And Asa Briggs.
And Asa Briggs did me the courtesy of reading the whole thing, and I was in Oxford. And that of course, are you sure that Asa Briggs was mentioned in my thesis?
Into the origins of the Labour Party in the public.
The origins.
Yes.
That's
yes.
a different matter.
Yes.
Yes. But I think that was because he did the courtesy of reading the manuscript before it went to press.
Yes. I mean, one of the, I don't know how you feel about it now, one of the criticisms that was made of the origins of the Labour Party, or has been made, is that you were never quite certain in your own mind as to the role played by the socialists as against the trade unions.
Yes.
In retrospect, what do you think of that criticism?
I think that's a fair criticism, and I think, of course, the trouble is the evidence of that in that period is very strongly in favour of the socialists, and you don't get very much on the trade union side. And if I were to do it again, I would try to get very much more research on the trade union side, and make it much fuller on that side than it is now. Yes, I think that is a fair criticism, that I was a little bit doubtful about that, and a little bit overtaken by the evidence. I mean, the papers were so interesting.
Yes.
There was such an interesting group of people that was very well worth writing them up in full. Also, of course, the Socialist League was very interesting too. I went to Amsterdam to get the Socialist League papers, and I was putting together there bits of paper which had been torn across in four when the Socialist League was disbanded. You know, when the Socialist League was disbanded in 1891, well, rather, I don't think, but I think it was more or less disbanding. What happened was that they were afraid of an anarchist. They were afraid that the police would. They were anarchistic. They were afraid the police would suddenly raid them and take off the whole lot. And so what they did was they bundled all their papers together and tore them into four pieces and put them into sacks. And these sacks were in fact bought by an Austrian socialist for 5 shillings a sack, and cut it off by him to the German Socialist archives. And he then eventually when at the time of the Hitler takeover in Germany, the German Social Democratic Party's archives went to Amsterdam.
Yes.
And so they were in Amsterdam till 1940. Then they came to London, to Oxford, in fact, for 5 years. Then they went back to Amsterdam, and still nobody touched them. And I was touching them for the first time in 1947 or so, reading these papers, which had never been touched before, and putting together various letters, which had not been put together at all. I don't think they've been put together even now, except Edward Thompson, of course, did some work on them for his Life of William Morris. But I'm not sure how far they've been put together even now.
I mean, I can see that
they haven't been published in full.
They would be very attractive to use, and I can see why you lent in that direction.
I could pick out the correspondence of Morris very easily. His writing was distinct, and so was Bernard Shaw. A good many Bernard Shaw letters were there. I was rather cross with the man who became the editor of the collected letters of Bernard Shaw. That he didn't, in fact, do more with these papers. He didn't use them at all. But still, he was interested really only in the literary side.
Yes. I mean, apart from doing more on the trade unions, which you now think you would do, if you were to start it again, and considering what an influential book that has been, is there anything else any other approach that you would now take that didn't occur to you when you published the book, say, in the late 1940s?
No, I think it was fair to do an examination of the socialist societies, but simply to emphasise, as I did emphasise, of course, that the number of socialists involved was really quite small, and they were mostly London-based.
Yes.
I think one was bound to say that they had an important role in the creation of the Labour Party and the origins of it. So it was worthwhile putting some emphasis on them, to be sure. And half the book, I think, ought to be devoted to that. I'm not sure that I feel that there was any other special emphasis I would have changed. No, I don't think so.
Do you think this was one of the things that obviously preoccupied you when you wrote the thesis? Then you wrote a well-known essay on it. Do you think there was any point at which the working classes could have been accommodated within organised liberalism? Say in the 1880s or 1890s, was there a crucial point?
Yes. Well, I think, and I actually said in the book that I thought the important thing was the non-recognition by the Liberals of payment of members of Parliament. If they had done that, they might have cut off the enthusiasm of the Labour members to stand with trade union funds only.
Yes.
It's possible, but it's not certain even so.
Yes.
But of course, comparisons with America come in there, I think.
Yes, I mean, you think that, so it is possible, so that the Liberal Party might have developed a bit like the Democratic Party.
Yes, quite, yes.
Whereas you tend to argue in that essay in Popular Politics that the changes really are rather structural ones, and the implication is you thought then there's probably not much the Liberal Party could have done about it. But you think it still was more contingent than that?
Yes. Yes, I think. Well, one can never foresee what's going to happen. I certainly think there was a possibility that it could have all been headed off, as it were.
Yes. I wonder if we could turn then to your interest in American history, because at the early 1950s, I think you went to the States. I wondered, did you become interested in American history precisely because of these kinds of comparisons, or was it because you had to teach American history, or what?
I think it was because I decided that when I was in Oxford, I had to teach a special subject, and the subject that was going in the 19th century. On the whole, the Oxford History School was very old-fashioned. They had very few special subjects in the 19th century even. And there was this American subject on slavery and secession, which I got interested in. And so another thing was that at Queen's College, where I was then a fellow, I always had an American colleague every year, a different American colleague every year, visiting professor from the United States, Harmsworth professor. And on the whole, they were very generous people, and they used to say, well, of course, you've come to the States, come and visit me. And so I did get an interest in American history, I think, from that. Some are very distinguished men, of course, some men who came to us. And so, to some extent, I took part in the formation of the British Association for American Studies at a conference in I think, 1952 in Cambridge, which was held in St. John's College, my old college. And this was a great experience for me because we had many distinguished American professors who came especially for the conference. And we had a good discussion of American history, many fields of American history there. And that really started me off in a big way on American subjects. And I was interested in comparing the development of the American left and the development of the British left in the later 19th century and 20th century.
Because that is, something that distinguishes you from someone like Eric Hobsbawm. It's quite clear that his comparative interests are primarily on the continent, though to some extent elsewhere, where yours are with the United States. And I wondered, do you think there is a quite distinct Anglo-American political culture which is separate from continental developments? Or
I think so. I think probably so. That must be so to some extent. Although, of course, there are many contrasts between the United States and Britain, as I found when I got there, partly when I got there, partly before I went there, but especially when I got there, one noticed that in many ways they were ahead of us in respect of, more progressive in the political sense, in having free education, for instance, to a much greater extent than we have. not having this private sector in the same way. There is a private sector, but it isn't quite as strongly developed as in Britain. And on the other hand, of course, the idea of nationalization in America is very difficult because all the states have their separate powers, and the contrast between that and the federal system and the British centralized system is very marked. So the idea of a socialist party developing in America with on the lines of a socializing party, a party which believes in nationalizing parts of industry and so on, is very unlikely in the United States.
When your first year in the States was at Wisconsin, is that right?
That's right, University of Wisconsin, which happened to have very good links with the left-wing movement.
I wondered whether
I chose it deliberately for that reason.
And those links were still quite strong, were they?
Yes.
Yes.
One or two of the professors there who I met were very closely. They were all liberals with a small L. That's to say, they were all on the radical wing of the Democratic Party, as I think most of the arts people in the United States are still. But it's especially marked in the University of Wisconsin, which had a very strong socialistic tradition, I would say, for itself as a community. The community of Wisconsin, they put a lot of money into their universities, tremendous amount of money, and they were very intelligent people who were working there, I thought, and they had this succession of professors of economics, in fact. Ely, Bishop T. Ely, and Selig Perlman were interested in the history of trade unionism and the history of socialism, and they had links with Britain. They managed to they continued to collect, they continued to get reports on what was going on in England from people like Ramsay MacDonald and H.M. Heinemann and so on. Lots of these papers were collected in the library of the University of Wisconsin, or Wisconsin Historical Society, which was a separate body. And that's so there's a great deal of research one could do on these papers in comparing the British and American left.
Right. And your interest in American trade unions was partly from the material that you saw at Wisconsin and that tradition, was it?
Yes. Of course, I was later invited to write a history of American labor in a series of books edited by Dan Boston, who was then a professor at Chicago, who I had met at some point, I think probably at a historical conference in Chicago of the American Historical Association in 1953 in the first place.
And do you think American trade unions took a very distinct path from British trade unions eventually? I mean, would you say, let's say, the developments of the 1930s sent them in directions which British trade union movement didn't go? Or
no, of course, in the 1930s, the development of the American unions seemed to suggest they were going to become more like ours than otherwise. But there were contrasts. Of course, they never, in fact, established a separate party. But in the 30s, it did look as if they were going to, much more now. That's more then than earlier. Before that, it's been such a purely craftsman movement.
Yes,
it seemed to be very unlikely they would ever develop such a thing.
Well, I suppose the development of the Rooseveltian Democratic Party to some extent lends support to your earlier view that you could have a Liberal Party with very close links with the trade union movement, or the labour union movement, and still hold together.
Yes.
You, coming back again to your British history, you wrote, I suppose, really what was a successor volume to the origins of the Labour Party with Frank Bealey, which does have much more trade union history.
Yes.
When you wrote that with him, were you conscious of any of these problems with the origins of the Labour Party? I mean, did you deliberately choose to write more on trade union history than you might otherwise have done?
I think so, yes. Of course, Frank had done a lot of work on the history of the papers of Herbert Gladstone, therefore on the Liberal side of the relationship between the Liberals and the Labour Party, and what was known as what we call the Herbert Gladstone Pact, the Entente. We call it the Entente, in sort of parallel to the Entente Cordiale, the Entente between the two parties, which came into operation in 1906 as an electoral alliance. And that was really why we came to collaborate. That was the origin of it. We also managed to work together fairly well because we were for some time living in the same house. I don't think it would have been anything like as easy if we hadn't been. At least for one long vacation, we were living in the same house in London. and we could work in separate rooms and give chapters to each other, and that was an important feature of liaison. Though at the last moment, I remember that Frank said, I said to Frank, "You've got a few corrections to make in this volume, final corrections. So will you bundle it up and send it off as a parcel to Macmillan's?" So he said, "I've never made up a parcel in my life." So I finally had to make up the parcel and send it off myself.
Did you ever think of writing a third volume? I mean, one that went...
Yes, I did. There was a man called Poirier who had been working on the same period, and he seemed to be interested in following up from 96 onwards. And so I really decided at that point that I ought to leave it to him, if he was willing to do it, to carry on from 1906 onwards. Of course, he didn't, in fact, use the papers at Transport House, which we managed to get at. All the same, he was obviously onto them by the time we published our book, more or less simultaneous with his. And so I didn't see why his book shouldn't be a success and fill the gap between 96 and 14, for instance, and perhaps possibly even go further. Mm. So at that point, I really decided I didn't really want to go beyond 1906 with this history of the Labour Party. That was the only reason why. Otherwise, I would have done, I think.
Mm. Did you, when you wrote your history of trade unionism, did you ever think of doing a book something like, say, Clegg, Fox and Thompson? I mean, a very large and detailed history of British trade unionism in the period.
No. I was asked to do that book by Jack Plum, who was then editor of the history series for Penguins, and I thought it was a one-off job only, which I did without fresh research, and therefore it was not really. I didn't intend to do a fully detailed work. No, I never had the idea of doing what Clegg, Fox and Thompson did.
Mm. I mean, you've kept that up to date.
As you revise it. Yes.
As you revise it, does your view about the trade unions change markedly from, say, now, almost 30 years on, I suppose, from when you originally wrote it?
I think the trade unions have changed, and so I think my views have changed too, yes, a bit. I think that, for instance, the winter of discontent was a great blow to the trade union movement generally. And therefore I think that my degree of sympathy that I expressed to the trade unions earlier was perhaps has been somewhat diluted since then.
And how far
this may come out in my latest revision of it.
And how far do you think, say, the winter of discontent was a discontinuity in trade union history, or how far do you think it was determined really by, I don't know, the last 100 years, the last 50 years? And it's a perfectly natural product of what happened.
I think it was probably the natural product, but it did show that the trade unions had got a very great deal of power, I thought, and perhaps too much power in the state, and therefore it probably ought to be reduced by some sort of legislation. So I became in favour of more or less, not precisely the Thatcher legislation, but gradually I thought the introduction of trade union democracy was quite a good idea, to the extent that it's happened in recent years.
I mean, why do you think these changes took place? Is it a change in the elites of the trade union movement, or was it the expansion into new areas of the economy
they were given great powers in the 1970s, which really were almost overreaching. And of course, some of the big unions were exceptionally powerful and not really terribly democratic. I mean, the Transport and General Workers Union was all right under Ernie Bevin, but under successive leaders, it's become a rather bullying union, I think, bullying other trade unions as well as bullying the country generally. And there was a point, after all, when Dennis Healy had to propose a budget which was conditional upon the trade unions accepting a certain degree of wage restraint. Now that was an extraordinary thing to do, to make the whole budget dependent upon what the trade unions decided.
Well, I suppose it's arguable, and if you look at the relationship between the Labour Party, the historic relationship between the Labour Party and the unions, that something like that was always on the cards, and it's perhaps surprising that these sorts of interventions didn't happen earlier.
Yes, I think that's true, yes. Maybe so. The trade unions were very loyal to Attlee, of course, in that period, in the 1940s. And what he said, they accepted. And they were also loyal to Bevin, of course, who transferred to the political side of the movement. But when Bevin died, of course, the thing began to change. the Transform General Workers' Union especially, having been the right-wing union, ceased to be so and became rather left-wing and refused to accept wage restraint. That, of course, was a rather difficult problem for future Labour governments to survive, to deal with.
And do you think the loyalty that the union showed to the Attlee government, say between 47 and 50, over things like wage restraint, was because they felt a greater identity between themselves and that government than happened in the 1970s?
Yes, I do, certainly, yes.
And why then do you think that sense of identity broke down?
I think it's simply an evolution of a development of the time. As time went on, things gradually changed. I wouldn't say there's any special reason for it other than the passage of time and the evolution of events, I suppose.
Well, on balance, do you think that British trade unions, again looking at it historically now, British trade unions encouraged or almost dispersed working class consciousness? I mean, would you have thought they were on balance more unifying than sectarian, or the other way around? And you suggest in your comments on the winter of discontent, you think the sectarian tendency is now very strong.
Yes.
But making a historical judgment, what would you say?
I mean, I think that is the judgment I would make.
And presumably the Labour Party necessarily has suffered from that.
Yes. Of course, I've ceased to belong to the Labour Party. I used to belong to it until 1981. And I then went off with David Owen.
Did you always vote Labour until then?
Yes, I did. Except on one occasion when a research student of mine was standing for Cambridge University. And I didn't think he was would be a very good MP, so I didn't vote for him. I actually voted Conservative on that occasion. It's the only time I voted Conservative in my life. That was a by-election.
That's rather surprising, actually. I mean, I could see you might vote Liberal, but voting Conservative.
I don't think there was a Liberal candidate at that time. I've forgotten now.
But on the whole, then, you would say that your political affiliations are to a kind of Attlee, Gates-Gillite Labour Party?
Yes, I think so. That's probably still true.
I wonder if we could...
Except, of course, since one can hardly claim Attlee or Gateskill, of course, for the present SDP, naturally. In fact, the curious thing was when the European election was, when the European referendum was taking place, the European movement took over the National Liberal Club headquarters. I belonged to the National Liberal Club as a member, and they labelled one entrance to the house Attlee House, which I thought was an absolute absurdity, because Attlee, of course, was very hostile to the idea of entering Europe. Of course, he was a man of his time. That's only understandable, really. But whether he would have changed in this respect, I don't know. I doubt it.
Were you in favour of entering Europe?
Yes, I was. Yes.
You published in the late 1960s, around 1969, a collection of essays, Popular Politics, which was, I thought, a really rather powerful critique of certain kinds of Marxist or semi-Marxist traditions in British historiography. And they also seem to me a conceptual defence of an empirical tradition, if you like, in a way that perhaps you hadn't done before. And I wonder if we could talk about two essays in particular. The first was on the labour aristocracy, where you were critical, particularly of Eric Hobsbawm's analysis. The second one on working classes and social reform. Taking the first one, when you wrote that, was it simply because you felt that the data simply didn't support this sort of semi-Leninist view, or did you set out to combat it on a more theoretical level? I mean, why did you...
It wasn't really theoretical. In fact, I left Eric's article a long time before I came and wrote this article, which in fact criticised it. A long time left. But I did think that he was taking not Marxist line, but a Leninist line. Lenin, of course, I don't think understood the British Labour movement insofar as, whereas Marx and Engels, I think, did understand it very much better. They lived in England for a very long time. Lenin only lived here for about a year. I think he got the wrong end of the stick in many ways. And his concept of the labour aristocracy was wrong, I think, absolutely wrong. And so that was really what I was criticising in that essay. But I didn't write it, I think, until about 10 years after Eric had first published his article.
I mean, why did you write it then? Was it just because you...
Just because I gradually got worked up on the subject, I suppose, very gradually. But I had been doing a lot of other things in the meantime.
I mean, do you think it's wrong because the notion is wrong, or was it wrong simply because the evidence didn't support it? I mean, if the evidence had been better, let's say.
Well, if the evidence had been better, of course, I would have accepted. But it seemed to me that there were so many areas of British labour history where it simply didn't apply. Among the miners, for instance, you can't say that there's an aristocracy among the miners in the sense that they form a separate union, for instance, from their less paid colleagues. They all belong to the same union. The hewers are in the same union as the surface workers. And there's no distinction between them. And also, there tends to be a situation in many professions, many occupations, where the worker tends to be well paid in the middle years of his life, poorly paid perhaps at the beginning, and poorly paid at the end of his life. And so there's a gradation of respectability and affluence. Also, of course, the Booth survey of London shows that there is this distinct middle group of people who are not doing poorly, not doing terribly poorly, but well above the level of sustenance, which wouldn't really fit into this category, this sharp difference between the aristocracy and the rest. I think that the labour aristocracy idea tries to draw a line between the section of the working class, which you can't really do. In fact, because Royden Harrison has just written a book called Division of Labour, I think these divisions can be too rigidly drawn very often. Many of the labour aristocrats are, in fact, rather in a position of being rather on the margin of aristocracy. Even if they're over it for a time, they drop out of work, or they become unemployed for a time, or they are short working, or one thing or another. They don't get the full amount that they're supposed to be getting if you take the whole rates of pay. So it didn't seem to be that the idea worked out very well in practice in the late 19th century, even when it was supposed to be working.
I suppose it's partly used to explain the absence of what you might call revolutionary politics in Britain before 1914.
Yes. That again I think is a mistake, because the revolutionary concept of politics does not depend upon the wealth of... In fact, you have a revolution of rising expectations among the working classes as well as among other groups of the population. And in fact, the better off people are, the more they expect to get in political terms as well. So in fact, the most active members of the Communist Party, for instance, if it comes to that, are from the labour aristocracy, or what might be termed as the labour aristocracy. For instance, I mean the better off engineers, for instance. All the same, there are many occupations where you can't draw a line. Of course, people said that when I wrote about the labour aristocracy, I was trying to have it both ways. I was saying, of course, it is true that some labour aristocrats do very well, and therefore, politically speaking, they are they're the most revolutionary. But also, I was at the same time denying the whole concept of the labour aristocracy. Now, of course, what I'm trying to do, I don't deny there is a sense in which you can speak of the labour aristocracy existing. There's no doubt about that. And in fact, the term occurs quite early in the 19th century in pre-Marxist works. It occurs, I think, in about 1820. People speak of an aristocracy of trades. And so I wouldn't deny that for a moment. But the question is whether you can say that these people have different characteristics, political characteristics, especially of a complacent, of a accepting character. That's the thing that I deny.
Yes, yes. I mean, I think you say something like, insofar as there was a labour aristocracy, it was likely to be more revolutionary than less.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
Well, given in your view, the apparent absence of a labour aristocracy, why would you think historically that the British working class politics did remain contained within the system, as clearly they did? Why the parliamentary politics retained such a hold over working class politics?
I think it was partly due to if you don't have a revolution for a very long time, you go on not having a revolution. I think that's part of it.
People just become conditioned.
You have an established tradition of relatively peaceful life. And also, of course, another thing is that London is a very long way from the main industrial areas of the country. The main industrial areas of the country were in the north. And it was a very long way. If you want to march down to London, and have a demonstration. You had, for instance, you had the Blanketeers who tried to march from Manchester. Well, I mean, they didn't get there. They mostly scattered on the way. They had their blankets over their shoulders, but they didn't. The weather. Another reason why you don't get revolution in this country is the weather's not good enough. You need a good deal of hot weather to have a revolution.
The Russian Revolution was in the winter.
Well, the Russian Revolution also took place in wartime when the Russians were losing the war, very obviously.
The other essay, I think, that excited most...
Before the winter, I would say.
Well, January, February. The other essay that excited this contention, if you like, was the one that argued that, on the whole, the working classes are favourable to social reform only after they've occurred rather than before.
That's right.
I mean, that was replied to in several senses. And I wonder, in retrospect, whether you think, or how far you think the replies are valid, or how far you would hold to your original argument.
I'm not sure what you think of as a reply, but...
we'll say Pat Thane's argument.
Well, Pat Thane, I think, more or less, in some ways, confirmed what I was saying. She didn't really reply to me. She was, to some extent, confirming what I was saying. I wouldn't say it was, in a sense, hostile to what I was saying.
Well, I mean, one argument might be that, okay, though you might be able to demonstrate that at certain levels there is working class apparent hostility to certain kinds of state intervention, say associated with the criminal law or the police. Why is it then that so many working class organisations like trade unions do seem to be favourable to social and political reform? And how does one explain that kind of discrepancy? And I take it that's what she was concentrating on, in a sense.
Yes. Obviously there are some working class organisations which are favourable to reform, but the question is how many and how strongly. That's the question, really. I formed my views after doing a great deal of work on the social geography of British elections. I've read a great many newspapers and a great many reporters reporting on how people were voting and why. I gradually came around to the view from that if you looked at elections very closely, the working class as a whole were not attracted by the ideas of, for instance, Joseph Chamberlain, who had quite relatively revolutionary ideas about what ought to be done, about extending reforms for the agricultural working class, for instance. And this didn't seem to me to work out in practice. And in fact, some of the talk at the 1885 election, for instance, was actually raised by the Tories as derision. I mean, some people thought that the idea of giving 3 acres and a cow was an absurdity for the ordinary working man. He didn't want it. It was impossible. So that began to make me think about these things. That was why I wrote that essay. In fact, if I hadn't done my own research, if I had employed a research assistant to do my work at that time, I wouldn't have got 2 books out of one subject, which I did at that time. One was the social geography of British elections. The other was the popular politics.
Yes. I mean, if you'd thought in those terms about whether and under what circumstances the working classes support social reform or socially progressive policy, would you have written The Origins of the Labour Party, or your thesis, or thought about it also in different terms? Would it have been more, I don't know, pessimistic than optimistic?
I don't think it has immediate application to that. That was an alliance of socialists and new women and various discontented groups who wanted representation in Parliament for different reasons. And there again, you see, you get the incompatibility between various groups who are in the Labour Party. It's one reason for examining it. I mean, the trade unions were not, of course, were not very much in sympathy with the socialists in the early years of the century. Most trade unions were not. Very few. Some trade unions actually belonged to the ILP, but they would tend to be the minority of them until after the end of the First World War, and then, of course, they changed a little bit, but not all that much even then. In fact, there was a sort of labourism, which I think one can speak of rather than socialism, which was the characteristics of the trade union movement.
I mean, why? I mean, you cited some reasons in your essay as to why social reform might be unpopular, and one of them was, let's say, the association of state intervention with police enforcement. What other reasons would you like to isolate?
I think there was a suspicion of the state because of the poor law. The way in which people came into contact with the state was through the poor law, and this did not seem to be a very friendly relationship at all. People were very hostile to going on the poor law and being put in these institutions, and that I think was the main contact that they had in those days. And so people wanted to keep out of the poor law institution as far as they could.
I mean, how far do you think, say today, the present government might be able to go in significantly dismantling the NHS, given your argument that these things do become popular after the event?
Yes, I certainly argue that various pieces of social reform become popular after the event, after they've been enacted. And that's been successfully true of a number of the reforms. I don't think the national insurance was all that popular to begin with because it involved a short-term contribution without very much immediate gain. But the National Health Service has been a tremendously populous thing in this country. I think will remain so. So I don't see that being extinguished in the near future, even though there may be cuts in it in some ways, for the time being at least.
So your views about both these essays have not really changed very much since you wrote them. You spoke of the social geography of British elections, and I wondered if we might talk about that. Did you ever think, I mean, first of all, why did you decide to work on this? Was it, you mentioned in the introduction the influence of André Siegfried, and I wondered whether you ever thought that kind of a study was possible in England, given the different kinds of electoral systems.
I thought it was worth seeing how far we could go with it. And of course, one can take it to a certain extent, but not all that far. On the whole, the French statistics are better by department, and you get a lot of figures by department, and
commune too, I suppose,
yes,
which makes it so much easier.
I think so. Yes, I thought it was worth seeing how far one could go.
And did this come from the interest in the unions and working class history, or were you otherwise influenced?
I think it was partly from that. Yes, partly from that direction.
And you did all this.
I want to see how far there was a transfer from liberalism to Labour also during those years. I thought there was critical years in British history, being 1885 and 1914. And nowadays, I think people are more interested in the period 1900 to 1930, perhaps.
And you did all the research for that yourself?
Yes.
Is it also true, just as a matter of interest, that you financed some of that research? And I read that you'd financed some of that research by wins on election bets. Is that true?
Well, I did have wins on election bets. I did bet on elections. I thought it was a way of trying to confirm my own judgment as a political theorist, or political behaviourist, I should say, to see how things. And in fact, in the early days, it was very easy to make money out of election betting. For instance, Ladbrokes in '64 were not terribly clued up about the value of opinion polls, for instance. So that it was.
So you just tended to follow the opinion polls.
Yes, one could. It's easiest, of course, with referenda. Not so easy. Not quite so easy with elections in general, especially if the parties are closely. And if there are three parties, it becomes even more difficult. So I'm not sure that I'm going to make much in the future from this source.
Are you happy with the result? I mean, now with the social geography, or do you think it might have been better to have concentrated on particular regions rather than doing a national study?
No, I set a certain fashion for people to study separate regions.
Indeed.
And of course, some people tried to do it for the following period, which I thought was not so, because you had a three-party situation between 1918 and 1939. That was not so easy to get at. Very difficult to divine precisely what was happening locally. But a couple of research students of mine did study, 3 students of mine, in fact, did studies of regional. I warned them against it in a way, but they insisted on doing it. They did studies of one did West Midlands, one did East Midlands, one did London area.
Successfully, do you think?
Well, none of them has resulted in a book.
Yes. I mean, do you think that...
I think one of them could have been a book, certainly.
Do you think the study confirmed your view that this period, 1886 to 1910, was a kind of watershed?
Yes, it was a period when there was a clearly defined two-party system, 1885 to 1910. So it was good for that purpose. And of course, there was the Irish were separate, but I didn't study Ireland. I simply left Ireland out. But
yes.
of course, Irish issues came into British politics as well,
yes.
naturally.
Do you think if the franchise had been more or less the same as it was after 1918, there would have been any significantly different movements of electoral opinion in that period, or do you think the results probably pretty much would have been the same?
I think it would have been the same. In fact, of course, there is a certain degree of controversy about exactly what happened in 1918, as you know, and it may be that not very much changed in 1918 in respect of the proportion of people who were able to vote.
I take it, therefore, that one of the consequences, perhaps unintended, of this book was to make you feel not so much that working class politics was futile, but it was less likely to lead to its own consequences than you thought it might otherwise have done.
Yes, I suppose so. That would be true, yes. Of course, the interesting thing was, doing that book, one was able to discover, all of a sudden, certain things standing out. For instance, one could see the corrupt boroughs standing out. Those were slightly corrupt boroughs. And they stood out from the rest, because they didn't have the swing, the electoral swing. David Butler had taught us all about electoral swing. And I applied that idea, although I didn't entirely agree with David Butler on all points, because he didn't believe in regional variations, which I felt was quite important, especially in this period before 1914. But you could see where were little boroughs which didn't react according to the rest of the pattern. And they were the ones, in fact, where there was corruption. One could find that from other sources. And so that was rather interesting confirmation of my approach, I thought.
Yes. The next major book you wrote was the biography of Churchill.
Yes, though I did write a little book on Britain and the Second World War.
Oh, yes.
Which was quite important in triggering off my life at Churchill.
Well, I wondered, perhaps we could then come to that, because you actually do face up to this question under what, in that book, under what circumstances social reform might become popular. And you have a chapter on the relationship between war and social reform. I mean, do you think that it's those kinds of circumstances which make people support social reform rather than others? Did you conclude in the end that the war was responsible in effect for the Labour victory in 1945?
No, what I think is that in both wars you had a reaction against the government which was in power at the beginning of the war. The reason for that was that what happened was, on both occasions, the Liberals were in power in 1914. Then the Conservatives were in power in 1939, and the reaction against them was because they hadn't, in fact, built enough battleships and, well, not battleships so much as tanks, and hadn't rearmed enough. All the same, the people who took that view had been responsible for this situation. It was the electors who were responsible for our relatively poor preparation for the war in both cases. All the same, they at the end of the war, they said, oh, the politicians must be to blame. And so they blamed them. That was really what happened.
Do you think that can explain the enormous swings to Labour in, say, the West Midlands or London?
Well, if you look at the enormous swings, Labour didn't get a majority of the vote in 1945. It was simply, what happened in 45 was simply what was to be expected in the end, after 35. The 35 election was a decisive one, which really knocked the Liberals out.
Yes.
Then after that, you were bound to get a reaction, a swing of the pendulum. But
a very big swing.
Yes, big swing, but all the same, there had been 10 years since the previous election, and people were fed up with the existing parliament. And I think that was what happened. Of course, I was criticised by Paul Addison in a review of my book on the Labour governments for saying that it was a swing of the pendulum that did it all, because he thinks it was some great, massive evolution of social reform during the war. I don't believe that was true. It is true that there were some aspects of social reform which came out from, for instance, the effective organisation of government and also of army operations, for instance. The planning which went into D-Day, for instance, was tremendously carefully planned, and that was something which did suggest to people that the government could also be well organised, more thorough in future, and depend less on private enterprise. And of course, the very success of the Russians also meant that people had denounced the Russian regime as likely to collapse at the first blow in 1941, and he didn't. They went on fighting and eventually winning against the Germans, and that was tremendously important, I think, as a factor, external factor, in the Labour success in '45. Although the curious thing was that the vote was transferred not to the communists in Britain, but although the communists did do better, they had many more members in '45 than they had in '39, many more members. But all the same, they still got some blame, obviously, for having been against the war between '39 and '41. So, I mean, they were regarded as being a representative of a foreign power, and not really a distinctively British party, not a British Socialist party. The Socialist Party, if there was one, was the Labour Party.
But those remarks do suggest that you think there were certain specific aspects to the war which contributed to the Labour victory, like people seeing how the state can actually organise, or the experience of the Russians.
That's true, yes.
Which is more than just a swing of the pendulum, presumably.
Yes, but I think there would have been a swing of the pendulum all the same. If the election had come earlier, then there'd be no war. If the election had come earlier, I think, again, the same thing might well have happened. You would, at some point or other, because after all, we really depend upon a two-party system, and the two parties alternate in government. So at some point or other, Labour would have had a reaction against the national government, and Labour would have won more seats, and perhaps a majority. If you've got a majority of only 50, it's enough to carry on for quite a long time. If you have a majority of 150, well, some of it is wasted, of course.
But you're sceptical about the notion that there was something in the Second World War, I don't know, a climate of opinion, or a social experience that made people peculiarly sympathetic to progressive politics in the way they weren't before or afterwards.
I think it went for a certain section of the middle class, but I don't think it went for the mass of the population. No.
So the big swings in the London suburbs, let's say, are partly to be explained on those grounds.
That's right. Yes.
But there were also big swings in working class constituencies.
Well, yes, that's true.
And how you would simply explain that on...
Well, don't forget there are quite a lot of middle class people who live in working class suburbs, working class areas as well.
Was it?
I think the pressure on them to vote Labour was very strong.
Yes.
Of course, another point is, of course, during the war, as it was noticeable at the end of the war that the soldiers voted left. But then young men always do vote more left. That's been the case of every election since '45. So I don't think anything special is to be read into that.
So it is then partly generational, I think, that the 10-year gap means largely...
And the opinion polls which were held during the war were held in the civil population only, not among the soldiers. So I don't believe that ABCA made the great difference.
Yes.
Some people say that R.A. Butler, for instance, says in memoirs the great difference was the ABCA lectures which officers gave. I gave some of those lectures myself to soldiers, and the soldiers themselves were, in fact, inclined to go to sleep in the lectures. That was not entirely my fault. The fact of the matter was, these lectures were mostly given when the soldiers were in training, and if they had a hearty morning's exercise out on the square, or anyway outside, out of doors, then they went into a lecture room. The obvious thing to do was to go to sleep. It was difficult to keep them awake. So I don't think that was an important factor. Also, if they had felt they were being given a propaganda line, they would have reacted against it.
So there was no way that you would have, when you were serving, would have been able to sense any kind of commitment to progressive politics among soldiers. I mean, you just don't think there was...
No, I don't believe it.
Yeah.
And of course, Angus Calder produces the argument in his book The People's War, that the Eighth Army was very left-wing. He quotes some poems written by a man called Hamish Henderson, who was a Scotsman who was in fact an undergraduate at Cambridge with me. And he wrote a poem about Stalin being a decent chap because he smokes a pipe and wears a taxi driver's cap. And this absurd poem, which was actually written when he was an undergraduate, not when he was in the Eighth Army at all, is quoted because he later on published a book of Eighth Army verse, which includes this poem.
Did you anticipate the Labour victory?
No. I don't think very few people did, in my view.
You didn't?
Not even Labour leaders did, after all. Yes. I think the only person among the Labour leadership who did was Herbert Morrison, I think. He had high hopes.
Were you aware of the opinion polls, or did you not know that they existed then?
I don't think I knew. No, I don't think... Well, the thing was, about the opinion polls, one noticed them, but the thing was, one always thought that Churchill, at the end of the war, would have the same sort of victory as Lord George, but he would get the credit for the victory. That was what one thought. After all, it's still true that opinion polls are not all that reliable for what's going to happen 2 years hence, or 1 year hence even,
Yes.
or 6 months hence, especially when a general election comes along. A by-elections also, you see, can be very misleading. They can lead to a tremendous swing, and then when the electors think, well, do we really want to replace this government, they may have second thoughts. So I don't think it's a very good guide.
What strikes me from looking at, say, diary reaction to the by-elections in the period,
Yes.
say Conservative MPs, they're actually appalled by the results.
Yes,
They then say, if this goes on, we're in terrible trouble.
yes.
But they're still surprised by 1945, when
Yes,
it actually does
that's
happen.
right. Exactly, yes, yes. I can understand that reaction.
Mm.
I think that meant for most, after all, Lord Beaverbrook, for instance, in the Daily Express predicted a Conservative victory of about 80. Now, mark you, he was no very good guide, but Churchill himself also expected a victory about that size.
Yes. Yes, well, R.B. McCallum told me that he always thought Labour would win simply because he believed the opinion polls. I mean, he accepted the existence of the opinion poll and he thought they were right.
He was almost unique.
Ahead of his time.
Not
Yes.
quite unique, but almost unique.
You said it was a result of this, the writing of the history of the Second World War, you became interested in Churchill.
Yes.
That was the only reason, wasn't it?
I think so, yes. I hadn't been terribly friendly to Churchill as a politician. I respected his great service during the war, but I thought it was a bit out of date, of course, in his whole outlook to things. But actually writing a life of him, I was puzzled by his role during the war and how he got this great eminence. And so I thought that needed more explanation. As a result of my writing this little book on Britain in the Second World War,
Yes.
I thought I wanted to explore his views and ideas a little bit more. And if you write a life of a man, you tend to get rather friendly to him, more so than if you don't. I mean, you get a certain sympathy with him. I probably wrote a much more friendly life of Churchill than he deserved, in fact.
Yes.
I think if I were doing it again, I would try and point out some of the points of difference which I feel with his attitude. For instance, I now think that he made a mistake over the whole Gallipoli business. That was a ghastly mistake. Because even if it had been successful, it wouldn't lead anywhere, I think. Also, I think that his actions in 1918 and 19 were quite wrong when he was the great advocate of the intervention against Russia, which hadn't got nowhere. And was, of course, the soldiers who were being sent there were volunteers, but they went, even so, with some reluctance, I think.
Yes. Well, since you started writing history, I mean, there have been immense changes in the way in which historians have approached social and labour history. One last question then. On balance, do you think we've gained or lost by this change?
You mean by the development more, for instance, more social history?
A more social way of looking at institutions, let's say.
Or do you mean more, for instance, development of econometric history?
No, I wasn't thinking of econometric history.
Because that has developed a great deal.
That has indeed, but say a more social approach to the history of trade unions.
Yes. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, because I'm not quite sure who has written about the social approach to
Well,
trade
let's say
unions.
take writing trade union history, as it were, through work processes like Richard Price has done with the builders. I mean, do you think that that's a gain or a loss?
Yes. I think there may be some gain to it. You mean work control?
Yes.
Yes, yes. There's something in that, yes. It's new approach of some help. I suppose I wrote my history of trade unions is a very large history of the institutions of trade unions as such, rather than a study of. But of course, they are political institutions.
Yes.
And they do operate in the political world, and they have this great importance in the Labour Party, among other things.